Racist cop grabs black woman in court, but her testimony flips prosecution and places him at the center instead. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Naomi Carter had learned long ago how to stand still in places where the air felt heavier than it should, and that morning the courtroom carried a quiet pressure that pressed against her shoulders like an unseen weight. She stood near the defense table, hands folded, posture calm, eyes forward, while the low murmur of benches settling and papers shifting filled the room. Naomi was a black woman in her mid-30s, dressed simply, composed in a way that suggested preparation rather than fear, and yet many eyes passed over her, as if she were only a name on a docket. The judge had not yet entered. The seal of the court gleamed above the bench, and the flag stood motionless, symbols of order waiting to be invoked. Officer Daniel Whitmore, a white police officer assigned to courtroom security, watched from the side with an expression practiced into neutrality, his presence blending into the architecture of authority that most people accepted without question. When Naomi stepped forward as instructed, the scrape of a chair echoed, and the room's attention shifted, not with respect but with assumption. The prosecution team organized their notes, confident in the momentum they believed they had built, while the defense counsel adjusted a tie and whispered to a clerk. Naomi felt the familiar sensation of being evaluated before she spoke, judged by posture and appearance rather than facts, and she kept her breathing slow, steady, measured in seconds that felt longer under the fluorescent lights. A small gesture from Officer Whitmore redirected her position, his hand guiding space as if it belonged to him, and the moment passed quickly enough that some pretended not to notice, yet long enough to leave a silence behind it. Naomi did not react outwardly. She simply adjusted her stance and met the center of the room with quiet resolve. She had come prepared to tell the truth, not to perform it, and she understood that in this room, truth often waited for permission. The prosecutor cleared his throat, confident that the narrative would move forward as planned, unaware that every detail Naomi carried was arranged carefully in her mind, ready to be placed with precision when her voice was finally invited. The judge's entrance brought everyone to their feet, the ritual restoring a sense of order. And as the court was called to session, Naomi's focus narrowed to the task ahead. She was not here to argue loudly or demand attention. She was here to speak clearly, to answer exactly what was asked, and to let the record reflect what had actually happened. The courtroom settled, the clock on the wall ticking softly, and in that stillness Naomi's calm presence contrasted sharply with the assumptions surrounding her. No one yet realized that the center of gravity in the room was already shifting, that the story the prosecution believed was secure had cracks visible only to the person about to testify, and that by the end of her words, the attention would no longer rest on her alone but turn, steadily and unmistakably, toward the officer who believed he was only there to observe. The courtroom settled into a measured rhythm as the clerk finished formalities and the judge's voice set expectations for order and procedure, a tone that suggested patience but not sympathy. Naomi Carter remained standing where she had been directed, aware of how the room seemed to rearrange itself around her presence, as if her stillness created an uncomfortable focal point. The prosecution moved first, outlining a sequence that sounded neat when spoken aloud, dates aligned, statements summarized, confidence conveyed through cadence rather than proof. Naomi listened without interruption, her eyes fixed on a point just past the bench, absorbing how her own experiences were being compressed into clean sentences that removed context and replaced it with assumption. Officer Daniel Whitmore shifted his weight near the rail, posture squared, hands relaxed at his sides, the posture of someone accustomed to being background authority, never the subject of scrutiny. He watched the proceedings with a calm that came from routine, not concern, confident that his role would remain peripheral. The judge asked a procedural question, the attorneys responded, and the room returned to a quiet hum that carried an expectation of inevitability. Naomi's attorney requested permission for her to testify when called, a request that drew brief glances from the jury, faces trained to read demeanor for meaning. Naomi felt the subtle pressure of those eyes and did not lower her gaze. She knew the power of timing, knew that speaking too early could dull the truth, and she waited. The prosecutor approached the lectern again, voice steady, framing events as isolated moments rather than a pattern, emphasizing compliance and order. Naomi recognized the technique, how authority often narrated itself as neutral while deciding who belonged within it. When the judge finally called her name, the sound seemed to travel farther than expected, echoing against wood and stone. Naomi stepped forward at a measured pace, every step deliberate, her movements unhurried, her expression composed. She placed her hand where instructed, affirmed her oath clearly, and took her position. A faint rustle moved through the benches as people adjusted, sensing a shift even if they could not yet define it. The prosecutor began with simple questions, establishing background, confirming dates, seeking agreement. Naomi answered without embellishment, her voice even, her words precise, resisting the pull to explain beyond what was asked. Each response landed quietly, but together they began to form a line that did not bend toward the story being told. The judge watched closely, eyes alert, pen resting still. Officer Whitmore's gaze followed Naomi now, curiosity replacing indifference as he registered the steadiness of her testimony. Naomi continued, describing moments as they occurred, noting what was said and where she stood, anchoring memory to space and sequence. She avoided judgment, avoided emotion, and that restraint carried its own weight. The jury leaned forward almost imperceptibly, attention sharpening. The prosecution adjusted its approach, asking questions designed to redirect, to narrow, to contain, but Naomi's answers remained consistent, unhurried, aligned. In that careful exchange, the room's balance began to tilt, not with drama, but with clarity, as the simple act of listening revealed gaps that confidence alone could not fill. Naomi's testimony continued with a steady cadence that contrasted sharply with the restless energy now moving through the room. And as she spoke, the small details began to matter in ways they had not before. She described where she stood, how instructions were given, and how compliance was expected without explanation. Her words, chosen carefully to reflect observation rather than accusation. The prosecutor attempted to guide her answers toward yes or no conclusions, but Naomi remained precise, clarifying when necessary, never raising her voice, never allowing emotion to blur accuracy. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing at the notes forming on the bench, while the jury's attention narrowed, eyes moving between Naomi and the questions posed to her. Officer Daniel Whitmore felt the shift before he fully understood it. An unfamiliar sensation that tightened his focus as he realized her account placed him closer to the narrative than he had anticipated. He straightened slightly, expression composed, yet his gaze lingered on Naomi with a new alertness. The prosecutor introduced exhibits meant to reinforce the original sequence, but Naomi responded by grounding each item in time and place, explaining what preceded and followed, revealing gaps that were not immediately visible on paper. Her voice remained calm, unhurried, and consistent, and that consistency carried authority of its own. The courtroom grew quieter, the usual sounds fading as people leaned in, sensing that the testimony was not merely filling space, but reshaping it. When the prosecutor pressed for a conclusion, Naomi answered with facts, not interpretations, allowing the implications to emerge naturally. The judge paused the proceedings briefly to clarify a point, and in that pause, the air seemed to hold its breath. Officer Whitmore shifted again, aware now that the attention he had avoided was beginning to find him, not through accusation, but through context. Naomi explained how procedure was enforced unevenly, how directions were delivered without room for clarification, and how compliance was assumed rather than confirmed. She did not speak of intent, only of experience, and that restraint made her testimony difficult to dismiss. The defense attorney listened closely, recognizing the quiet power of what was unfolding, while the prosecution adjusted its approach, questions becoming more cautious, less declarative. The judge's pen moved steadily, capturing moments that would later require careful consideration. Naomi concluded a segment of her testimony and waited, hands relaxed, posture unchanged, as if confident that the truth did not need embellishment to stand. The prosecutor conferred briefly with a colleague, then resumed, attempting to reframe, but the effort felt strained, the earlier certainty replaced by calculation. Officer Whitmore felt an unfamiliar heat at the back of his neck, not from confrontation, but from recognition that his role was no longer invisible. The jury exchanged brief glances, a silent acknowledgement that the story they were hearing no longer aligned neatly with the opening statements. Naomi answered the final question of that sequence and returned to stillness, eyes forward, expression neutral. The judge nodded, signaling a transition, and the room released a collective breath. In that moment, it became clear that the center of the case was shifting, not through spectacle, but through the accumulation of clear, measured truth, and that the proceedings ahead would no longer move in the direction originally intended. As the proceedings moved forward, the courtroom atmosphere tightened into something more focused and less forgiving, as if the space itself had decided to pay closer attention. The judge allowed a brief adjustment in questioning, and the prosecution resumed with a tone that suggested control, yet the earlier confidence no longer carried the same weight. Naomi Carter remained composed, responding to each inquiry with the same measured clarity, her words forming a steady line that did not waver under pressure. The questions now circled closer to procedure, to who gave instructions and how they were enforced, and with each answer Naomi placed responsibility where it belonged, not through accusation, but through sequence. Officer Daniel Whitmore felt the attention settle on him in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of attention that arrived quietly and refused to leave. He shifted his stance again, posture still disciplined, but the ease he once carried had thinned, replaced by an awareness that his actions were now part of the record. The judge interjected to clarify a timeline, and Naomi answered with precision, anchoring moments to specific points in the day, reinforcing consistency rather than conjecture. The jury listened with intent expressions, some taking notes, others simply watching the exchange unfold as the shape of the case evolved before them. The prosecution attempted to redirect, framing authority as necessity, but Naomi's responses emphasized process over perception, reminding the room that procedure existed to protect fairness, not override it. The defense attorney rose briefly, requesting acknowledgement of a procedural discrepancy Naomi had identified, and the judge nodded, allowing the point to stand. That small recognition shifted the room further, a signal that the testimony was not merely informative but consequential. Officer Whitmore became acutely aware of how still he had become, how every movement now felt amplified under the gaze of the court. He maintained his composure, yet internally he recognized that the narrative no longer flowed around him. It pointed toward him. Naomi concluded another set of answers and paused, eyes steady, as the judge reviewed notes and considered the implications. The silence that followed was not empty. It was weighted, filled with the understanding that clarity had replaced assumption. When the prosecution resumed, the questions were narrower, more cautious, as if testing ground that no longer felt secure. Naomi answered without hesitation, reinforcing what had already been established, allowing repetition to strengthen credibility rather than dilute it. The judge addressed the courtroom, emphasizing the importance of accuracy and reminding all parties of the standards expected within the proceedings. Officer Whitmore listened closely, recognizing that those standards now applied to him as much as anyone else present. The jury's focus sharpened further, attention divided between Naomi's calm presence and the officer who had been, until now, a silent fixture of authority. As the session approached a natural pause, the judge signaled a brief recess, instructing all parties to remain mindful of the testimony presented. Naomi stepped back with the same measured composure she had shown throughout, her role unchanged in demeanor, yet transformed in impact. Officer Whitmore remained in place, aware that the center of the courtroom had shifted toward him, not through confrontation, but through the steady accumulation of truth that had quietly redefined the direction of the case. When the court reconvened after the brief recess, the atmosphere carried a different texture, less routine and more deliberate, as if every person present understood that the direction of the day had changed. Naomi Carter returned to her place with the same calm presence, yet now her stillness drew attention rather than deflected it. The judge resumed with a reminder about clarity and relevance, signaling that the next phase would require careful focus. The prosecution stood again, posture straight, voice measured, and began asking questions that attempted to re-establish control by narrowing the scope. Naomi answered steadily, her responses grounded in sequence and observation, reinforcing points already placed into the record. As the exchange continued, small inconsistencies emerged, not through contradiction, but through contrast between expectation and fact. The judge paused to ask for clarification on a procedural step Naomi had referenced earlier, and her answer connected the timeline with precision, linking moments that had previously been treated as separate. The jury followed closely, expressions attentive, as the connections began to form a clearer picture. Officer Daniel Whitmore felt the weight of that attention settle fully on him now, not as an accusation, but as an inevitable consequence of context. He maintained his professional stance, yet the awareness that his conduct was being examined openly changed the way he perceived the room. The defense attorney requested permission to introduce a point related to courtroom procedure, and the judge allowed it, noting that the testimony had raised questions that required acknowledgement. Naomi listened quietly as the discussion unfolded, her role temporarily shifting from speaker to reference, the source of clarity others now relied upon. The prosecution attempted to assert that authority required decisiveness, but the judge responded by emphasizing that decisiveness did not excuse deviation from established process. That distinction settled into the room, quiet but firm. Naomi was asked one final series of questions, and she answered without hesitation, reaffirming details already shared, allowing consistency to speak for itself. Her voice remained even, neither defensive nor assertive, simply precise. Officer Whitmore recognized that the narrative no longer centered on what he intended, but on what had occurred, and that distinction mattered. The judge reviewed notes again, then addressed the courtroom, acknowledging that the testimony had introduced substantial considerations regarding conduct and procedure. The words were careful, measured, but their implication was unmistakable. The prosecution requested a brief moment to consult, and the judge granted it, the pause filled with a quiet anticipation. Naomi stood where she was, composed, eyes forward, understanding that the truth she had presented did not need reinforcement. When the proceedings resumed, the judge announced that the focus of inquiry would shift to address the procedural concerns raised during testimony. The room absorbed that statement, a collective realization passing through the benches. Officer Whitmore felt a subtle tightening in his chest, not from fear, but from the recognition that his actions were now central to the court's consideration. The jury watched him openly now, curiosity replacing assumption. Naomi stepped back slightly, her part in the moment complete, as the structure of the case realigned around the clarity she had provided. The judge concluded the session with instructions that emphasized accountability and fairness, setting the stage for what would follow. As the gavel came down, the courtroom did not return to routine. Instead, it held onto a sense of resolve, aware that the balance had shifted decisively, and that the center of the proceedings now rested where authority had least expected to be examined. The following session opened with a controlled stillness, the kind that arrives when a courtroom understands it is no longer observing a routine matter, but examining itself. The judge addressed the parties with measured authority, stating that the inquiry would now proceed with a focus on conduct within the courtroom and adherence to established procedure. Words chosen carefully, yet carrying unmistakable weight. Naomi Carter stood quietly to the side, no longer the center of attention, yet her presence continued to anchor the room, a reminder of how the day had turned. The prosecution adjusted course, acknowledging the shift without conceding fault, and the judge directed attention toward Officer Daniel Whitmore, requesting clarification regarding his role during the moments described in testimony. The request was procedural, neutral in tone, but the effect was immediate. Officer Whitmore stepped forward as instructed, posture straight, expression composed, aware that this was the first time his actions were being examined aloud rather than assumed appropriate. He answered the initial questions with professionalism, describing standard responsibilities and expectations, language familiar and rehearsed. The judge listened without interruption, allowing the explanation to stand before introducing the context established by earlier testimony. Naomi watched as the sequence unfolded, her earlier words now serving as reference points rather than arguments. When the judge asked about specific timing and instruction, Officer Whitmore responded carefully, choosing precision over speed, yet the contrast between intention and outcome became increasingly visible. The jury observed closely, attention fixed on the exchange, aware that clarity was being tested against record. The prosecution attempted to frame the situation as a matter of miscommunication, but the judge redirected the focus toward responsibility, emphasizing that authority carried obligation to ensure clarity rather than assume compliance. Officer Whitmore acknowledged the principle, his voice steady, yet the acknowledgement seemed to narrow his options rather than broaden them. Naomi remained still, her expression neutral, understanding that the truth did not require her to intervene again. The judge referenced procedural standards, citing expectations of conduct within the courtroom, and asked Officer Whitmore to explain how those standards were upheld in the situation described. The answer arrived measured, yet incomplete, gaps evident not through contradiction but omission. The room felt the shift collectively, a quiet recognition that what was missing mattered as much as what was said. The jury's attention sharpened further, pens moving, eyes lifting and lowering in rhythm with the questions. The judge paused, reviewed notes, and then clarified that the court would treat the matter with seriousness, not as an allegation, but as a necessary examination of conduct affecting fairness. Officer Whitmore nodded, maintaining composure, though the awareness that he now occupied the center of the inquiry was unmistakable. Naomi's role receded further, her testimony having done its work, her silence now a form of restraint rather than withdrawal. The prosecution requested additional time to review procedural guidelines, and the judge granted it, signaling that the court would proceed deliberately. As the session continued, the tone remained calm, but the direction was clear, and the courtroom no longer viewed authority as an abstract presence, but as a subject accountable to the same standards it enforced. When the judge concluded the segment, outlining the next steps with clarity and firmness, the room absorbed the message without resistance. Naomi stood composed. Officer Whitmore returned to his position with a new awareness, and the jury carried forward the understanding that the case had reached a point where truth had shifted the lens entirely, placing responsibility where it could no longer remain unseen. The courtroom returned to order with a focused intensity that left no room for distraction, and as the judge resumed, it became clear that the inquiry had reached a decisive point. The judge addressed the court with deliberate calm, summarizing the procedural findings established through testimony and clarification, each sentence reinforcing how the sequence of events had shifted the case's foundation. Naomi Carter stood quietly to the side, her role now one of witness to consequence rather than catalyst, her earlier words continuing to guide the process without her needing to speak again. The judge turned attention back to Officer Daniel Whitmore, not with accusation, but with a request that carried unmistakable gravity, asking him to respond to the procedural discrepancies identified and to explain how they aligned with courtroom standards. Officer Whitmore answered carefully, his tone professional, Yet the contrast between expectation and record had become too clear to soften. The judge listened, then referenced the established timeline, noting how authority exercised without clarity undermined fairness within the court. The room absorbed the observation in silence. The prosecution remained standing, visibly restrained, aware that the focus had shifted beyond their original case theory. The judge then addressed the jury directly, explaining that the testimony had altered the scope of consideration and that the court had an obligation to address conduct impacting the integrity of proceedings. That explanation reframed the moment, placing responsibility at the center rather than assigning blame prematurely. Naomi watched as the attention she had once carried moved decisively toward the officer, not through spectacle, but through process. Officer Whitmore stood composed, yet the reality that he was now the subject of inquiry settled visibly into his posture. The judge cited specific standards of courtroom conduct, outlining expectations that applied equally to all present, regardless of role. Each reference aligned with Naomi's testimony, creating a through line that connected observation to consequence. The jury followed attentively, expressions thoughtful, recognizing the significance of what was unfolding. The prosecution requested clarification on next steps, and the judge responded by stating that the court would proceed with a focused review of conduct, separate from the original charges, ensuring that fairness remained central. That statement marked a clear turning point. Naomi felt a quiet resolve settle within the room, an understanding that truth, once articulated clearly, had redirected the entire proceeding. Officer Whitmore acknowledged the court's direction, his voice steady, though the awareness that authority did not shield him from accountability was now undeniable. The judge emphasized that the court's responsibility was not to punish, but to uphold standards that protected the rights of all participants. The words carried weight precisely because they were measured. As the judge concluded the session, outlining how the inquiry would continue, the room remained silent, attentive, respectful. Naomi stood composed, her role complete, understanding that her testimony had done exactly what it was meant to do. Officer Whitmore remained at the center of attention, not through confrontation, but through the careful alignment of fact and procedure. The jury prepared to deliberate on the new focus, aware that they had witnessed a rare moment when the system corrected its own course. When the gavel signaled adjournment, the courtroom did not disperse in noise, but in quiet recognition that the balance of the case had fully turned, placing accountability where it belonged and affirming that clarity, when allowed to speak, could reshape the direction of justice. The next session unfolded with a composed seriousness that reflected the court's commitment to resolution rather than reaction. And, as the judge resumed, the framework for accountability was set with clarity and restraint. The judge outlined the findings that had emerged from testimony and procedural review, emphasizing that the court's role was to preserve integrity through measured action. Naomi Carter stood quietly among the observers, her presence steady, her expression calm, aware that the truth she offered had already taken its place in the record. The judge directed attention to Officer Daniel Whitmore, explaining that the court would proceed with formal steps to address the conduct identified, steps designed to ensure fairness and prevent recurrence rather than assign public spectacle. Officer Whitmore listened attentively, posture composed, acknowledging the direction with professionalism, though the shift from authority to accountability was unmistakable. The prosecution accepted the court's guidance, noting that the original matter would be adjusted in light of the findings, a recognition that underscored how the process had been redirected. The judge then addressed the jury, explaining the scope of their consideration moving forward, reinforcing that the justice system functioned best when it examined itself with the same rigor it applied to others. The jury nodded collectively, absorbing the responsibility entrusted to them. Naomi observed the exchange, understanding that the impact of her testimony was now institutional rather than personal. The judge continued by detailing the procedural measures to be implemented, including a formal review and documentation aligned with established standards, language precise and careful to avoid excess while ensuring clarity. Officer Whitmore acknowledged the measures, his voice steady, the weight of consequence carried without drama. The courtroom remained attentive, the absence of noise reflecting a shared understanding that accountability did not require confrontation to be effective. The judge reminded all parties that adherence to procedure was fundamental to trust, and that moments like this, while uncommon, were necessary to uphold that trust. Naomi felt a quiet affirmation in those words, a recognition that dignity and patience could guide outcomes just as powerfully as assertion. The defense attorney briefly requested confirmation of a revised procedural path, and the judge provided it, ensuring transparency for all present. The prosecution affirmed readiness to proceed within the adjusted framework, signaling closure to the earlier uncertainty. Officer Whitmore remained composed, acknowledging the court's authority with respect, aware that the process unfolding was designed to correct rather than condemn. The jury prepared to deliberate within the clarified scope, their attention focused and purposeful. As the judge summarized the session, reiterating the court's commitment to fairness, the room felt settled, aligned by a shared sense of responsibility. Naomi stood still, her role complete, her testimony having reshaped the proceedings without requiring further intervention. When the judge concluded, noting the next steps and timelines in clear terms, the courtroom absorbed the information with quiet resolve. The gavel signaled a pause rather than an end, a moment that marked the transition from revelation to responsibility. Naomi remained calm as people began to move, aware that the outcome was no longer about her presence, but about the standards now reaffirmed. Officer Whitmore prepared to follow the court's direction, carrying forward an understanding that accountability within the system strengthened it rather than diminished it. The room dispersed with a sense of measured purpose, reflecting a justice process that had corrected its course through clarity, patience, and adherence to principle. The final session arrived without spectacle, marked instead by a calm clarity that suggested the court had reached its understanding and was prepared to affirm it. The judge entered, acknowledged the room, and addressed the proceedings with a steady tone, summarizing the course that had unfolded and the principles that guided the outcome. Naomi Carter stood among the observers, no longer the subject of inquiry, her posture relaxed yet dignified, aware that her role had shifted from participant to witness of resolution. The judge spoke about accountability as a function of fairness, emphasizing that the court's responsibility extended beyond individual cases to the standards that govern them. Officer Daniel Whitmore listened attentively as the judge outlined the conclusions drawn from testimony and procedural review, conclusions rooted in clarity rather than assumption. The language was precise, measured, and firm, reflecting a process that valued correction over condemnation. The judge explained how the court's findings would be recorded and how oversight mechanisms would ensure adherence to established conduct moving forward. Officer Whitmore acknowledged the court's direction respectfully, his composure steady, the lesson unmistakable. The prosecution accepted the resolution without argument, recognizing that the integrity of the process had been preserved through transparency and review. The jury was addressed one final time, thanked for their attention and diligence, and reminded that their role had contributed to a fair and thoughtful outcome. Naomi observed this exchange quietly, understanding that justice did not always arrive with noise, but often with alignment. The judge concluded by reaffirming the court's commitment to equal standards for all, noting that authority carried responsibility, and that clarity was essential to trust. Those words settled into the room, resonating beyond the immediate case. As the proceedings drew to a close, the judge signaled adjournment, and the gavel sounded once, not as an ending, but as confirmation. Naomi remained still for a moment, reflecting on how patience and precision had guided the outcome. She felt no need for acknowledgement, knowing that the truth had been heard and had done its work. Officer Whitmore prepared to depart, carrying with him a renewed awareness of the expectations tied to his role, an understanding shaped not by confrontation, but by accountability. The courtroom began to empty slowly, conversation subdued, expressions thoughtful, as people carried the weight of what they had witnessed into the hallway beyond. Naomi stepped forward, moving with quiet confidence, her presence unchanged by the outcome, yet affirmed by it. She did not look back as she exited, understanding that justice did not require her to linger. Outside the courtroom, the sounds of the building resumed their usual rhythm. Yet something had shifted beneath the surface, a subtle recalibration of trust and responsibility. Those who had been present would remember the moment when clarity redirected authority, when patience reshaped the course of a proceeding. Naomi walked onward, her steps measured, carrying with her the knowledge that dignity, when paired with truth, could realign even the most entrenched structures. The case concluded not with triumph, but with balance restored, a quiet affirmation that the system, when held to its own standards, could still correct itself and move forward with purpose.